The year is 1945, and the geography of the Second World War has become a tightening noose. In the east, the once unstoppable machinery of the Wehrmacht has ground to a halt, replaced by the desperate, ragged rhythm of a retreat that looks more like a funeral procession. The Soviet juggernaut, fueled by 4 years of unimaginable slaughter and a thirst for biblical retribution, has finally breached the borders of the German Reich. East Prussia, the ancestral heart of the Prussian military aristocracy, is no longer a fortress. It is a slaughterhouse. As the Red Army surges toward the Baltic coast, a wave of human misery precedes it. Millions of civilians, terrified by reports of the atrocities at Nemmersdorf, are fleeing into the biting wind of the coldest winter in decades. They carry their lives in wooden carts and frozen rucksacks, moving toward the only exit left, the sea. This is the setting for Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation in human history, an undertaking that would dwarf Dunkirk in scale, yet remain shrouded in the dark, icy shadows of historical neglect. At the center of this desperate exodus sits a ship that was once a floating monument to Nazi arrogance. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff was never intended to be a lifeboat. Launched in 1937, she was the flagship of the Strength Through Joy program, a state-run leisure organization designed to bridge the class divide and indoctrinate the German worker through subsidized luxury. She was a cruise liner, a palace of the proletariat, white-painted and gleaming, carrying the name of a murdered Nazi party leader. For years, she cruised the fjords of Norway and the waters of the Mediterranean, a symbol of a regime that promised 1,000 years of prosperity. But by January 1945, the Gustloff is a grey, rusted ghost of her former self. She has spent years pier-side in Gotenhafen, serving as a floating barracks for the 2nd U-boat Training Division. Her engines are calcified by neglect, her hull is fouled, and her once luxurious cabins have been stripped of their finery to make room for bunks and military equipment. She is no longer a jewel of the Baltic. She is a target. The systemic failure of the Gustloff's final voyage begins not on the waves, but in the chaotic bureaucracy of a collapsing state. As the Soviet pincers close around East Prussia, the port of Gotenhafen becomes a cauldron of panic. There is no central authority, only a desperate scramble for space. On the morning of January 30, 1945, the pier alongside the Gustloff is a sea of humanity. Official records suggest that roughly 6,000 people were manifest, but the reality was far more claustrophobic. Soldiers, wounded veterans, and elite U-boat trainees were ushered aboard first, but then the gates were swamped. Thousands of women and children, their faces etched with the grey exhaustion of the trek from the east, pleaded for passage. In the confusion, the boarding officers simply stopped counting. People were pulled through cargo ports, families were squeezed into every available square inch of the sun decks, the hallways, and even the drained swimming pool. Historians now estimate that over 10,000 souls were packed into a vessel designed to carry fewer than 2,000. This overcrowding was the first domino in a sequence of structural disasters. The ship's life-saving equipment, boats, rafts, and vests, was calibrated for a fraction of the current load. Furthermore, the sheer weight of the human cargo affected the ship's stability and maneuverability. But the most critical systemic failure was the command structure itself. In a display of the friction that plagued the late-war German military, the Gustloff was commanded not by one man, but by 4. Friedrich Petersen, a veteran merchant captain in his 70s, held the senior civilian rank. Alongside him were 2 other merchant captains and Wilhelm Zahn, a young, aggressive lieutenant commander of the Navy who represented the interests of the 2nd U-boat Training Division. From the moment the lines were cast, these men were locked in a battle of egos and conflicting doctrines. Petersen, cautious and weary, wanted to stay in the shallow coastal waters to avoid Soviet submarines. Zahn, thinking like a combatant, insisted on the deep water lanes to avoid the threat of British mines. It was a fatal schism that would decide the fate of 10,000 people. The weather on that Tuesday was a character in itself. The temperature had plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. A blizzard lashed the Baltic, and the sea was a churning mass of black water and ice floes. On the decks of the Gustloff, the spray froze instantly, coating the lifeboats in layers of thick, unbreakable ice. The anti-aircraft guns, the ship's only defense against the Soviet Air Force, were rendered useless, their mechanisms frozen solid by the Arctic gale. As the ship cleared the harbor and entered the open sea, the tactical blunders began to mount. The Gustloff was accompanied by only one small torpedo boat, the Flaw, after her other escort developed a leak and was forced to turn back. This left the massive liner virtually defenseless. Then, a radio message arrived, warning of a German minesweeper convoy approaching from the opposite direction. Fearing a collision in the blinding snow, Captain Peterson made the unthinkable decision to activate the ship's navigation lights. For a few brief minutes, the Wilhelm Gustloff glowed like a beacon in the pitch-black Baltic night. It was an act of navigational prudence that doubled as a death sentence. To the east, lurking in the depths, was the Soviet submarine S-13. At its helm was Alexander Marinesko, a brilliant but troubled commander who was facing a court-martial for his erratic behavior on land. For Marinesko, the massive silhouette appearing in his periscope wasn't an appose, just a ship, it was his path to redemption. For over 2 hours, the S-13 stalked the Gustloff, maneuvering into a position between the ship and the shore. Marinesko was patient, calculating the lead and the speed of his target. He saw the lights. He saw the lack of a proper zigzag pattern. He saw a Titan of the Reich served up on a silver platter. At approximately 9 p.m., he gave the order to fire 4 torpedoes. Each was painted with a dedication, unquote, for the motherland, unquote, unquote, for the Soviet people, unquote, unquote, for Leningrad, unquote, and unquote, for Stalin, unquote. The 4th torpedo jammed in its tube, but the first 3 found their mark with surgical precision. The first torpedo struck the Gustloff's bow, near the crew quarters. The second detonated directly under the drained swimming pool, where hundreds of female naval auxiliaries were sleeping. The third tore into the engine room, plunging the entire ship into darkness and silencing the pumps. The impact was not just a physical blow, it was the beginning of a social and psychological collapse. Inside the swimming pool area, the scene was one of pure horror. The explosion had shattered the decorative tiles, turning them into high-velocity shrapnel that shredded the occupants before the freezing seawater finished the job. Throughout the ship, the screams of the trapped echoed through the lightless corridors. Because the ship was so heavily overloaded, the stairwells became bottlenecks of desperation. People were trampled in the dark, while others, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, chose to end their lives with their service pistols rather than face the black water. On the upper decks, the irony of the unquote, strength through joy unquote, design became a literal death trap. The promenade decks had been enclosed with heavy glass to protect vacationers from the wind. Now, as the ship began to list heavily to port, these glass walls prevented thousands of people from reaching the lifeboats. They were trapped like insects in a jar, watching as the black Baltic rose to meet them. The ice that had accumulated on the davits made it nearly impossible to lower the boats. Some fell vertically into the sea, spilling their occupants into the killing cold, while others were crushed against the hull. The water temperature was roughly 4 degrees Celsius. In such conditions, the human body has minutes before the heart stops. Those who jumped were met with a shock so profound it often induced instant cardiac arrest. Mothers held their children above the waves until their arms grew numb, only to watch them slip into the abyss. The darkness was punctuated only by the dim red lights of life vests and the occasional flare from the Flaw, which was desperately trying to pull survivors from the water. Among the chaos, there were flashes of the unquote, unsung heroes unquote, often lost in the sheer scale of the tragedy. The crew of the Flaw and other small vessels that arrived later, like the Tu-36, worked with a frantic, suicidal bravery. They stayed in the area despite the known presence of the Soviet submarine, their searchlights cutting through the snow to find bobbing heads in the swell. Young sailors leaned over the rails, their own hands freezing to the metal, to haul slippery, oil-coated survivors onto their decks. One of the most haunting stories is that of the ship's youngest passengers. Of the estimated 5,000 children on board, only a handful survived. The heavy winter coats that were meant to protect them from the cold became anchors once they hit the water. In the final moments, as the Gustloff's stern rose high into the air, the sound of the ship and Apo's internal structures collapsing was described by survivors as a roar of screaming metal. Then, just 70 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the Wilhelm Gustloff vanished beneath the waves. The aftermath was a silence that lasted for decades. Because the sinking occurred during the chaotic collapse of the Third Reich, and because the victims were Germans at a time when the world was reeling from the discovery of the Holocaust, the story of the Gustloff was largely suppressed or ignored. It did not fit the narrative of the time. For the Soviets, it was a legitimate military victory against a troop transport. For the Germans, it was a trauma too deep to articulate amidst their national shame. When the final tallies were estimated, the numbers were staggering. Over 9,000 people had perished in a single hour. It was, and remains, the greatest loss of life in a single ship sinking in human history, 6 times the death toll of the Titanic. Yet, for years, the wreck lay at the bottom of the Baltic, a mass grave forgotten by the tide of progress. The historical and philosophical takeaway of the Wilhelm Gustloff is a meditation on the indiscriminate nature of total war. It represents the moment when the institutionalized cruelty of a regime finally collapsed inward, crushing its own people in the process. The ship, named after a man who preached racial superiority, became the tomb for the very vocal he claimed to represent. It is a stark reminder that in the theater of high-stakes geopolitics and systemic military failure, the bill is almost always paid by the most vulnerable. History often prefers clean lines and clear villains, but the Gustloff offers only the messy, freezing reality of human suffering. It is a story of how hubris, combined with the friction of command and the cold mathematics of submarine warfare, created a vortex of tragedy. The ship remains there today, a protected war grave, resting in the silt and the dark, a silent witness to the night the Baltic turned into a graveyard.